Welcome back to another edition of Dave Smith Unleashed, brought to you by MTS Transportation, 800-640-6873. Reliable, on-time delivery, compliance you can count on, round-the-clock support, superior communication, experienced logistics partners, and mention the Dave Smith Unleashed podcast and get 20% off on your next shipment. So kind enough to join us for part two for the interview of the greatest LA sports talk show host of all time and a good friend of mine, the great Steve Hartman. Steve, thanks for hanging in here for a part two. This is the best thing about a podcast. You don't have to worry about the commercial breaks or time or anything. We can just roll and roll and roll here.
Yeah, and you and I can do that, Dave. We have the ability to continue to talk and talk and talk because we have so much to cover.
Well, the end of part one, you talked about that 1969 Lakers final. But I don't know if my dad and my uncle ever got over that. They were both at that game, and they came home. They were furious for a week after that about Butch Van Bredikoff. And Wilt tweaks his knee a little bit late in the fourth quarter, comes out of the game. The Lakers make a comeback against the Celtics. He says to Tommy Hawkins. Tommy Hawkins told me this story. Tell Coach I'm ready to go back in. And Tommy Hawkins told me, Butch looked at me and said, "You tell that MFer we're better off without him. Stay on the bench." Is that a true story? It's unbelievable.
Well, it is unbelievable. But again, they were down 17 points. And Wilt goes out, and the next thing you know, they're within one. They had brought in Mel Counts, and, Jerry West was doing his best. I've watched the replay of that fourth quarter a million times. You can see it on YouTube. Yes. And the Lakers had their chances at the end. And guys missed shots. And the Celtics got the lucky bounce from the Don Nelson shot. And it's simple that. I don't know how much of a difference Wilt would have made down the stretch. I understand as a coach, we got some momentum. We are down 17 with Wilt in the game, and now we're down 1 with him sitting on the bench. So I understand where Van Bredikoff was coming from. There was no love lost between Wilt Chamberlain and Van Bredikoff that first year. And that's unfortunately the way it ended for the Lakers. Now, again, Van Bredikoff left after that season because that was going to be the end of him. And so, remember, Joe Mulaney came in for a couple of years, and then, of course, they bring the great Bill Sharman to finally win that first championship in 1972. But, yeah, that was a twofold. That's when I certainly was entrenched as Jerry West being my biggest sports hero. 53 points in that first game, still the only player on a losing team to win the NBA Finals MVP award, which was awarded that year for the first time. And also my hatred of the Celtics started that series. So I just like this team is like, remember Sam Jones hit a last-second shot to win one of the games in Boston. The home team won all 6 games until that last game. So I just felt like, what is up with this Celtics team? Why are they getting all the bounces, all the luck? And so a deep-rooted hatred for the Celtics started that year.
See, that was the genius of Bill Sharman again. When he first got the Lakers job in 1971, he knew that Wilt didn't like to go to practice, and Wilt liked to sleep late, and Bill wanted to institute the shoot-arounds in the mornings, and he knew Wilt wasn't going to go for it, so he met Wilt for lunch out in Marina Del Rey. And see, this is the genius of Sharman. He didn't say, "You will do this, I'm the boss, you're going to do what I tell you to do." He made Wilt think like it was his idea. He complimented him. He made him the captain of the team, and he bounced around some ideas, and he made Wilt think the shoot-around was his idea. That's how he got him to do it.
Well, he also forced Elgin Baylor to retirement. So Elgin Baylor in 1970 was still an all-star. Then he got hurt. He played only 2 games during the 70-71 season, tried to come back at the start of that 71-72 season, and then played 9 games. He was obviously a shell of the player he had been. And I'm sure Bill Sharman, along with Jack Hancock, has said, Elgin, it's over. Because they had a young guy named Jim McMillan. And they put McMillan into the lineup after I can literally remember Chick Hearn on the air. I remember I'm in 8th grade and I'm sitting there and I was taking a shower. I'm listening to my transistor radio. I'm in the shower and this big, Chick Hearn comes on that Elgin Baylor is retired effective immediately. Jim McMillan's in the lineup, and that started the 33-game winning streak. It literally started with Jim McMillan's first start in the NBA, and that set the Lakers off on that unbreakable record of 33 consecutive wins. I went to 1 game that year. It was against the Bulls during the regular season. My dad and I went out to the Forum, and I had been to a couple of games the year before. And, again, it was unbelievable, and they still had to get that big hurdle. The Bucks were defending champions. They had to play the Bucks. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar at that point was, a better player than Wilt. But Wilt played out of his mind. Wilt was the finals MVP. And the irony of their win over the Knicks in the final, no Willis Reed, Jerry Lucas was at center, so the Knicks were a little bit undermanned, is that Jerry West had a horrible series. I mean, he had a horrible series. But the Lakers still won. And that was just a magic time for any Laker fan. And for many years, it looked like that would be their only championship until a guy named Jerry Buss bought the team.
Well, speaking of Jerry West, he had such a great relationship with Dr. Buss throughout most of his career, and he did a tremendous job, of course, in personnel and making trades and with the draft and continuing the Showtime tradition that I think Bill Sharman built, making the Kobe trade, getting Shaq to come as a free agent and winning 5 more in that era. But, boy, the way it ended was so strange. Dr. Buss chose Phil Jackson over Jerry West, probably because his daughter was dating Phil. He had to make a decision because they despised each other, and Phil really despised Jerry West, and it was just so strange. And he said on the radio that he wanted to come back to the Lakers before he went over to the Clippers, and no dice. They were going to hire Magic Johnson as their president of basketball operations. And then Jeanie does a radio interview, and she names the 5 most important Lakers of all time and leaves West off of it. So what was it all over? Because I remember Jerry West said it was inappropriate and Phil and Jeanie shouldn't be dating. Was it all over that? Is that what it came down to?
I don't know. Look, I know, like we talked about this show Winning Time that I was a part of, like grossly exaggerated the personality of Jerry West, but it wasn't that Jerry West was, quiet. I mean, Jerry West was a strong-willed individual that had strong beliefs in what he believed was the best way to put together a basketball team. Look, to me, there are 3 players that stand out as the most important players in Laker history: Jerry West, Magic Johnson, Kobe Bryant. They're career Lakers. The bigs are all great, but they came from elsewhere. And, we're talking about lifelong Lakers. The 3 most important Lakers ever were Jerry West, Magic Johnson, Kobe Bryant, period. Okay. And again, great players: Kareem, Wilt, Shaq, all great players. Okay. But those are the mainstays in the history of Lakers basketball. But for Jerry West, who, by the way, fortunately, was recognized by the Basketball Hall of Fame as an executive before he passed away, and deservedly so. He's one of the greatest executives in the history of the National Basketball Association. Yes, on par with Red Auerbach. So, a lot of this kind of jealousy stuff, whatever. The bottom line is that when Jerry moved on, the Lakers still won. And that's the bottom line. Look, Dr. Buss admitted he made a mistake by firing Phil Jackson after the 2004 season. I was in Detroit for all 3 of those games when they got blown out by the Pistons to lose that series. Kobe just shot him right out of the series. Bye-bye Shaq, bye-bye Phil. And Jerry Buss admitted, I made a mistake with Phil Jackson, and brought him back. And guess what? He got a couple more championships out of it. So as far as the Jerry West situation, I think there was a difference in philosophy on how to run an organization. And once the Lakers showed that they could actually win without Jerry West, and I figure at that point they decided it's best that he stay on the outside.
Wait, I don't know if you've ever read Mind Games by the great Roland Lazenby, who's written so many great books about the Lakers and about the NBA. And he said in that book that the year before Phil got there, Kurt Rambis's last year as coach, the Lakers are practicing in the Forum, and Jerry's sitting up there in the stands with a bunch of reporters around, and Roland was one of them. And somebody said, what about Phil next year? Because he's out of work. He'd be a perfect fit. And they said the steam was coming out of Jerry's ears. And he said, F Phil Jackson. F Phil Jackson. We don't need him. He was screaming because I think he knew the writing was on the wall that if Phil came in, it might be time for him to go. He didn't want to hire him.
Well, I understand. I mean, Phil Jackson has an insane ego. I covered Phil Jackson a lot during their last couple of championship runs, really the balance of his coaching career. The last 5 years, I was at a lot of Laker games. Here's the one thing about Phil Jackson. He would never, ever, ever admit that he was at fault for anything, ever. He called out players. He called out everyone. Phil Jackson would never even hint that any blame should be on his shoulders. I always said this. It was very similar to Pat Riley, one of the biggest egomaniacs that I ever met in my entire life. But if you're going to coach superstar players, you have to have an ego greater than theirs. And in Pat Riley and Phil Jackson, that's exactly what you had. So Phil and Jerry West knew all about Phil Jackson. He's like, Phil Jackson is like, when these two guys were sitting on the bench in those 72 and 73 semifinals. There's Pat Riley on the Laker bench, a horrible player. Phil Jackson, a horrible player. Some freaking bench warmers. And now they're going to be telling me what to do. Are you kidding me? So, I can only imagine for Jerry West, looking at a guy like Pat Riley or looking at a guy like Phil Jackson, like, are you kidding me? How did this happen? We're handing them the greatest players on the planet, and they're walking around like they're, what doesn't stink. So for a guy like Jerry West, I'm sure just, he's like, I had to put up with Pat Riley. And believe me, everyone's like, oh, they were buddy. No, they weren't. I promise you they weren't. He was just, I got to put up with Riley. We're winning. Let this egomaniac run amok. And then it's like, I'm going to start over again with Phil Jackson's ego, that bench warmer. Are you kidding me? So I can understand why Jerry was upset.
Now, the story that the media and the Lakers put out is Jerry was burned out after that second championship run with Kobe and Shaq under Phil. But I think the truth is, in the playoffs during the second of those championships, they had a big win. I think it was against Sacramento, maybe. And Jerry walked down to the locker room to congratulate the players. And Phil turned around and saw him walking into the locker room and said, "Get the F out of here, Jerry. Get the F out. You don't belong here." I mean, he humiliated him in front of the entire team. And no action was taken by Dr. Buss, no discipline. So I think at that point, Jerry said, "That's it, I'm done." And he resigns just a couple of days later.
It's always amazing. We always think, obviously, of Jerry West, but, his post-career, he ends up, obviously, with Memphis. But really, it was Golden State. Do you realize how much Jerry West changed the whole dynamic of Warriors basketball? Yep. So they finally have a year where they make the playoffs. They've been awful, the Warriors. They have this young star in Steph Curry. They brought in this young kid, Klay Thompson. And they felt like they needed a big. Like they had to get a big. And so there was news that Kevin Love was on the market at that point, one of the best young bigs in the NBA, and they could get him if they were willing to trade Klay Thompson. And, they got Bob Meyer there, and they're going to make a change of coach and everything. And Jerry West said, if you make that trade, I'm out of here. If you are dumb enough to make that trade, count me out. And so they didn't make the trade, and the rest was history. Again, when I talk about the greatest executives in the history of the NBA, there are really only two names that should be mentioned: Red Auerbach and Jerry West. Geniuses in terms of chemistry,
yes,
how to put a team together.
Absolutely.
And then the fact that the Lakers turned their back on Jerry, I was just aghast all the way until his passing. But it was what it was, and that was a decision. And the bottom line is that since her father had made that decision with Jerry, she wasn't going to reverse course on what her father had done with Jerry West. There was no way Jeanie Buss was going to bring Jerry West back over her father's grave. That's her mindset, and she was not going to do that.
I watched Shai Gilgeous-Alexander play a lot when he was a rookie with the Clippers, and I thought he was sensational. I said, this kid has a chance to be elite, maybe a Hall of Famer one day, and I loved him when he played at Kentucky. And I know Jerry West was against that deal when they made that trade for Paul George and the Oklahoma City Thunder, when they gave him, say, SGA and 5 number 1 picks because they thought, they were afraid Kawhi Leonard was going to sign with the Lakers if they didn't make that deal, and he was never going to do that. He didn't want to play with LeBron, and he didn't want to go back to Toronto. They should have called his bluff and not made the deal. Jerry West, offered more picks. He offered other players. He desperately tried to keep SGA out of that deal, and he went to management and said, we shouldn't do this. This kid's going to be a superstar. But against his wishes, they made the deal, and look at him now. It turned out to be a steal for the Thunder.
Well, again, this was the leverage that Kawhi Leonard had at the time. And Steve Ballmer comes in, a man that is one of the 10 wealthiest people on the planet, worth well over $100 billion. And so, he's like, we're going to start over. The Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, that's over. We're going to start over again. I need Kawhi Leonard. I mean, he's the hot ticket right now. And Kawhi had all the leverage in the world. And he said, look, I want to play with Paul George. It was coming off a year, by the way, where he was third in the MVP voting. It wasn't like Paul George was, he had seemingly taken his game from his Indiana level to a different level with OKC. But you're right. I mean, I actually, it was 6 number 1s. Let's make sure. It's 21. Yeah, we still have another first round pick. In fact, OKC, after winning the champ, think about this. So, obviously with Jalen Williams and Chet Holmgren, these are all guys that got through the draft, with all these picks that they picked up. They have 5 number 1 picks over the next 2 years. They have 5 number 1 picks over the next 2 years.
Second youngest team to win an NBA championship. They're set up for a
it's
great run here. Yeah.
Unless Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, people forget this. The youngest team ever was the 77 Blazers. And the following year, they were 50-10. 50-10 to start the year, and then Walton gets hurt, and that was it. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Michael Jordan, and Wilt Chamberlain. Only 3 players in the history of the NBA to have at least 3 consecutive years of averaging at least 30 points per game and shooting at least 50% from the field. 3 players. Wilt, Michael, Shai. Pretty good company.
And only 4 players have been the scoring champion, regular season MVP, and finals MVP. He's in great company there, too.
Yeah, I am underwhelmed by their coach. Dagnall, to me, looks like a guy that is in over his head. There's no way that series should have gone 7 games. Just no way. The lapses that OKC team had, and then obviously the luck out with Halliburton going down early in the final game, so Indiana just didn't have the players. But obviously this is a team now that has an opportunity to dominate the rest of this decade, unless they have some serious injury. If the Clippers had not handed Shai Gilgeous-Alexander to OKC, which was a 20-win team at the time. Remember, they're, by the way, 22 wins, whatever they had the first year Shai was there. They wouldn't be where they are right now. But again, this gets down to hiring the right people. That's why we were talking about the whole Mark Walters situation with the Lakers. He's going to hire the right people. Rob Pelinka, he's going to okay. You have a contract. How much do we owe you? Get out of here. I mean, I need a real general manager.
You know what I think they should do? I think Sam Presti's the greatest general manager, not only in the NBA, but in all the professional sports. Out goes Pelinka and make him an offer he can't refuse to run the Lakers.
See, that's where the money comes in. Again, you have a cap. And by the way, people don't understand this about the NBA cap. They say, well, he'll pay the luxury tax. It's not just about paying the luxury tax. You know some of the penalties if you go over the cap? How about the fact that your first-round pick drops to the bottom of the first round? So let's say you have the 10th pick in the draft, and then you're over the cap. Your pick automatically goes to the back of the first round. There are a lot of penalties, and the NBA is making sure that you can't just walk in and buy a championship. They do not want that, which is fine. But where you can spend your money is to bring in the top coaches, top general managers. This is how it operates. And again, you've got to have the right people at the very top. And it's no secret why certain organizations are perennial winners and certain organizations are perennial losers. It starts at the top: ownership, decision makers. These are the people that ultimately are responsible for the success or failure of these organizations.
And I remember when Sam Presti was the assistant general manager and director of international scouting and director of college scouting with the Spurs. He was 29 years old, found Tony Parker, found Manu Ginobili, and, of course, Tim Duncan, and a lot of the international players they surrounded them with, and the good picks coming out of college. And I remember when Jeanie was doing a show with me once a week, this was around 2005, 2006, I was begging her on the air. Sam Presti's the guy. He's a superstar. There's not a better personnel guy in the NBA. He should be your next GM. But, Steve, nobody ever listens to you and me, do they?
They don't, and that's unfortunate for them. Look, I said, the thing about Jeanie is she's about friends, loyalty.
Yes.
The Magic Johnsons, the Linda Rambuses, the Kurt Rambuses, the Kobe Bryants, who with Rob Pelinka is his agent. I mean, I assure Laker fans, it's over. That is over. They will get the absolute top people in the positions that matter in an organization now that Mark Walter is running the show.
Somebody asked me the other day, I wanted to ask you this, Steve. I never thought I'd be saying this in a million years. But, this was, I think, the lowest rated finals in years because it was 2 small market teams. There wasn't a lot of buzz. There wasn't a lot of interest in Oklahoma City against the Indiana Pacers. And somebody asked me the other day, what do you think would get better ratings, this NBA finals or if Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever make the WNBA finals? And I said, you know something? I think the WNBA finals would get better ratings with Caitlin if she's there than this NBA finals got. I never thought I'd say that in a million years.
Dave, here's the reality. During the NBA finals, the biggest basketball headlines are out of the WNBA.
That's right.
Easily. There was far more buzz about Caitlin Clark hitting the floor, all these, elbows, shots to the face, getting shoved than anything that was happening in the NBA Finals. It wasn't even close. Look, I've said this before. Right now, the number one impact basketball player in the world and arguably athlete in the world is Caitlin Clark.
I agree with that.
When you talk about the difference, this is the same thing it was with Michael Jordan, the same thing it was with Tiger Woods. When you can actually see the difference of her in a game, her not in a game, in terms of eyeballs, in terms of conversation, in terms of anything. There is no athlete in the world right now that moves the needle to a greater extent than Caitlin Clark. I would recognize this. Who are the most recognizable basketball players in the world right now? By leap years, LeBron and Steph are still the two most recognizable faces in the NBA. Caitlin Clark is in that group. And guess who's fourth? Angel Reese.
And she can't
play. More
play.
people recognize Angel Reese than Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. I promise you, it's not even close.
I tweeted the other day, Steve, I said, Angel Reese is the worst basketball player I've ever seen, and I've seen Mark Landsberger up close. She is terrible. She can't play.
Well, she has absolutely no shot. Look, she's a rebounder. That's what she is. I mean, she's a rebounder. That's what she does. She led the league in rebounds. She can't make a layup. She can't shoot at all. Rodman couldn't shoot. He was a rebounding machine. We've seen players like this. But Angel Reese right now, is more recognizable than any NBA player save Steph and LeBron. Any. So you can talk about Anthony Edwards. You can talk about Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. You could talk about Luka. You could talk about Giannis. Jokic. You can give me any name. I promise you there are more people. Forget Caitlin Clark. Obviously, more people know her. More people know Angel Reese.
What do you think about the current state of the NBA, Steve? I know scores are higher, and it's an up and down game compared to what it was in the '90s with all those low scores. But to me, it looks like noon ball at the YMCA. They walk up the court and jack up 50 or 60 threes every game. It's not the basketball we grew up with. And plus, the league's gotten so woke and so politically correct. I think that turned a lot of fans off as well.
Well, they certainly didn't do themselves any favor with the Black Lives Matter situation down in Florida. They just didn't. I understand why they did it. I understand. You have a league that obviously is overwhelmingly African-American. The players asked for it. And under this leadership, Adam Silver works for the players, which is an amazing thing. Because the last time I checked, a commissioner is supposed to work for the owners. They're the ones paying them. But this guy cowed to the players on day one when he forced the sale of the Clippers of Donald Sterling because there was all this talk about some kind of player revoke if Sterling wasn't removed from the league, and he set the bar. Adam Silver everyone used to talk about praising Adam Silver. Adam Silver is a freaking joke.
Agreed.
And he has absolutely plummeted to the bottom of the list of commissioners in professional sports. Yes, he's even worse than Gary Bettman, if you can believe that.
He's also a complete hypocrite, along with LeBron and Steve Kerr and these guys.
Well, again, he doesn't know what to do anymore because he doesn't have a voice. Well, he's not going to stand up to the players. He's allowed this load management to happen in this league. I mean, everything negative about the NBA is on his plate.
And his refusal to condemn the Communist Chinese Party for the genocide of the Uyghurs and the people of color being used as slave labor and being genocided to make product for the NBA for shoes and gear and lining its pockets with blood money, I think makes him a complete hypocrite when he talks about social justice and civil rights.
Again, that's exactly what he's done. These players, if everyone's like, how is it possible? When you look at the minuscule ratings that the NBA produces, that players are now going to be making, I mean, we're talking contracts that eventually are going to get to $80 million a year.
Yep.
$80 million a year. And you're like, how's this possible? Who the hell's watching the NBA? No one's talking about the NBA. No one watched the NBA finals. China.
Yep. That's
People that go to China. When you go to China, the NBA is everywhere. And so, yeah, I mean, this is what the NBA is. The owners, again, the job of the commissioner is put money in the owners' pockets, right? That's his job. And he's able to do that by cozying up to China. And that's why the NBA financially is in the position they are, because it defies logic when you look at the kind of numbers that the NBA finals have produced over the last several years. And the other problem for the NBA just has been this carousel of teams. 7 different teams in the last 7 years have won the NBA championship. Oh, that's like parity. It's the worst possible thing for team sports is parity. You're like, oh no, it's worse when there's a dominant team. No, it's not. Look at the ratings for the NBA Finals when he had 4 consecutive LeBron versus Golden State. Huge numbers compared to where they are now. I mean, double what they are now. So there are a lot of problems moving forward for the NBA. By the way, the ESPN fiasco for the NBA final. Oh,
that broadcast crew and the studio crew were the worst I've ever seen. Why did they get rid of Jeff Van Gundy and Mark Jackson? I like them.
Why?
They were good.
By the way, speaking of Jeff Van Gundy, I have been screaming, if you're the New York Knicks, hire Jeff Van Gundy. You're going to hire Mike Brown? Get out of here. Mike Brown? Hire Van Gundy. The Knicks fans would love Van Gundy. He knows how to coach in New York. Van Gundy is a guy. Now, I know Tibbs is his guy. He's his protege. Tibbs was Van Gundy's protege that maybe not feeling comfortable walking over his dead body. Fine, give him a call. I don't know why the Knicks don't hire Van Gundy. But when you talk about Van Gundy and Jackson again, Burke, she's whatever. First of all, is it just me? Is it my TV? Or is the crowd noise so loud that you can't even hear what the commentators are saying anyway? Is it just my TV? I can't even hear them. Maybe they're just purposely trying to drown them out.
You know what I'm concerned about, Steve, is Inside the NBA is the best studio show I've ever seen on TNT. Now, ESPN has bought the rights, and they're going to leave it in the Atlanta studio, and they're saying they're not going to change anything, and they're going to have the same producers, but I think ESPN won't be able to resist butting in. I'm concerned they're going to try to force Stephen A. Smith onto that set, and Monica McNutt and the ESPN people who have ruined the NBA coverage. And hopefully Shaq and Kenny and Ernie and Charles Barkley put their foot down and say, no way. But they're going to try to force Stephen A. Smith up onto that set.
Here's all I'll say about Stephen A. Smith. So when his first run at ESPN failed, the next thing you know, he's relegated to joining us at Fox Sports Radio. And I did 4 or 5 shows with Stephen A., co-hosted shows with him. And he couldn't have been nicer. Honestly, he couldn't have been nicer. My first meeting, though, with Stephen A. Smith was at the 2005 USC-UCLA game at the Coliseum. That was when Leinart and Reggie, playing a 1-loss UCLA team, blew the doors off of them. And Stephen A. Smith was doing that original late night show. Remember, it was like a talk show he had at ESPN that failed miserably. He shows up at the press box of the Coliseum with 2 bodyguards. In the press box with 2 bodyguards. I understand he now has 9 bodyguards.
Really?
9. Does he need 9 bodyguards? Obviously, he doesn't. It's about ego. It's about show. So I've always said this about money and fame. Money and fame amplify the person you are. You really are. I'll tell you another prime. Chris Berman was a prime example of that. One of the biggest jackasses I've ever met in the business. And as his star grew at ESPN, as ESPN grew with their association going back to the 80s with the NFL, this guy became a bigger jerk year after year after year. And now we're at that point with Stephen A., where his ego now, he's doing acting. Like he showed up in some TV show, wasn't even playing himself. Like he thinks he's an actor now. He wants to run for president. He's trying to get into the political arena. He's trying to get in everywhere. And you know what it reminds me of, and you and I remember this, was Howard Cosell. Howard Cosell in the 70s, ABC put him on everything.
That's right.
He was on baseball. And it was like he was so bad. get him off the air.
And he got his own variety show, remember?
The Stars competition, they would film that out in Pepperdine. He was there. He had the late night show that honestly became really Saturday Night Live.
That's right.
And so they put him everywhere to the point of absolute exhaustion. Like, is it necessary, ABC, to have to put Eric Cosell on everywhere? And that's apparently where ESPN is right now with Stephen A. Smith. And, I love that screenshot of him playing, what was it, solitaire during the game? Yeah. And they got him over his shoulder playing during the game. I don't know what to say. My personal interaction with him was fine, but this is a disaster. And if they even dare put him on with Shaq and Ernie and the Jet and Charles, that it would be there's no tolerance for that. But ESPN is known to these things. That's why yours truly has never. I had many overtures with ESPN, and one of my favorites all time was they wanted me to do their afternoon drive show at the LA station. They had just hired a new program director. And of course, they had contacted me. I mean, I'm not looking for a job, obviously, at that point. And he said his final thing was, look, we can't pay you what you're making, but you will be working for ESPN. I'm like, okay, let me think about this. No, would be a quick answer. Yeah, they actually had the nerve after they approached me to come to ESPN to offer me less money for the honor of working for ESPN. That's all you need to know about ESPN.
And finally, Steve, before we let you go here, we both were introduced to Lakers basketball with that 72 team. That was our team. I used to, on Sundays, I used to take a bath, and my parents would give me a bath, and I'd have the radio out on the counter listening to Lakers home games with Wilt and Jim McMillan and Goodrich and West and Happy Hairston and all of them. And I remember when I grew up, about 2 or 3 times a week, I would play noon ball at the Santa Monica YMCA. They had recreational basketball. So we're lining up to play one day, and there's an older guy there. He has like gray hair and a gray beard. And the other guys on my team said, well, you take the old guy. And I didn't know they were playing a prank on me. I said, all right, I'll guard him. This ought to be easy. And he was just raining jump shots on me, Steve, one after another after another. He must have made 15 or 20 in a row, and they beat us. And I'm getting to drink with him at the fountain after the game. I said, man, you can really play. I introduced myself. He said, oh, nice to meet you. My name's Flynn Robinson. I said, I said, oh, my.
A forgotten hero of that 72 team. I mean, he was that there'd been a 6 Man of the Year award back in the day. Flynn would have been the guy.
Yeah, behind the ear rainmaker shot. And my friends were all laughing. They said, we set you up, baby. We knew who he was.
It was such a different NBA. My dad took me to a game against the Golden State Warriors. They played Golden State upset Milwaukee the next year in 73.
That's right.
In the opening round, and the Lakers ended up playing Golden State in the Western Conference Finals. My dad took me to one of those playoff games. And then, of course, the Lakers will lose the rematch to the Knicks the following after that, and then was gone, and that was the end of that. It was a magical time, and I will say this for Laker fans. I think the frustration of what we've seen over the last 10 plus years is going to end. Again, now they've got ownership that is knows how to put together the right pieces to have a winning organization and actually make the Lakers legitimate championship contenders. Understand this: there's 7 years with LeBron James. 5 of those years, they either missed the playoffs or were out in the first round. 5 of the 7 years. They had one fluky run to the Western Conference Finals, and then, of course, a bubble championship that no one but Laker fans recognizes. So those days, and prior to that, 6 straight losing seasons. So, I think the Laker fans are in for some good news in the future with Mark Walter now.
Did you see what Alex Caruso said after the game last night?
I did not. What did he say?
They talked about winning the championship because he was on that Lakers bubble championship team. And he said, wow, finally a championship that counts. Ouch.
Exactly.
Ouch.
If you remember when they were in that bubble, the Lakers were the only team that had anything to play for that year. Kobe had died. There was a lot of emotion. It was a golden opportunity for LeBron to sort of steal a championship that year because most of the players that went into the bubble wanted to get out as soon as possible. They're like, I don't want to be sitting here under quarantine for weeks on end. So that's why when people look at that Lakers 2020 championship, there was no parade. There was nothing. No one watched. It was in the middle of the football season. No one saw it. No one recognizes it. But LeBron was able to use that and say, boom, there it is. I won a championship with the Lakers. I delivered a championship. I was finals MVP. And, case closed. And they've been paying for that ever since with LeBron's domination in the organization. Look, I have recognized LeBron. I always say this. The most dominant player in the history of the NBA was Wilt Chamberlain. Most dominant. The biggest draw in the NBA's history is Michael Jordan. The player that has the deepest resume is LeBron James. Three entirely different things. You can have the best resume. I used to say Kareem had the biggest resume. The fact is LeBron has surpassed Kareem in terms of all NBA, all stars, all these different things, all-time leading scorer. That's like a resume, numbers. No player had a greater impact in terms of eyeballs than Michael Jordan. The most dominant player in the history of the NBA was Wilt Chamberlain.
Yep,
no question about it. Themselves. So that's the way I break it down. But it is time for the Lakers to rid themselves of LeBron James ASAP.
Steve, great stuff as always. I appreciate you doing this. We got to do this again soon. And as always, love talking to you.
Anytime, Dave.
There he goes, the great Steve Hartman on Dave Smith Unleashed, brought to you by MTS Transportation at 800-640-6873. Reliable, on-time delivery, compliance you can count on, round-the-clock support, superior communication, experienced logistics partners. And mention the Dave Smith Unleashed podcast and get 20% off your next shipment. Follow me on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, at Dave Sports God. And I'm always posting when the next show is going to be up, so we'll talk to you then on Dave Smith Unleashed.